the idea is, of course, that the more people are connected with a full camera and microphone, the connectivity is not as good, and we like this conference to be as practical and as undisturbed for technical reasons as possible. Also in this conference, we prefer to see faces and hear voices. So when we will come to the Q&A sessions, I would ask you to ask for the floor using the chat function. Simply put RS, request to speak, or type if a question, request to speak. That will allow us to first see the chronological request for questions, which is easier for us to manage them and give the floor on a first come, first serve basis. But furthermore, we would ask you not to use the raise your hand function in Teams, for those of you who are familiar with that, simply because they're not, or unlike in a real room, in a virtual room, we do not see who has raised their hand first, and I cannot, unfortunately, have this visual memory of where the hands were raised first. So please, if you have a question to ask, do so by simply requesting the floor, requesting for the floor to speak in the chat function, and do not ask your questions in the chat, because we will not be able to answer them all or follow this in parallel. Of course, when you are asking a question, do not forget to unmute your microphone and turn on your camera, and do so again, and switching them off right after you have asked your question. We would also appreciate if you could name, or just give your name and function, or your organization or role that you play in your organization. And last but not least, I would just like to remind everyone, as it was also indicated in the email that you received for the invitation, this conference is recorded, and the full recording will be made available on our website later on. Having said this, it's high time for me to give the floor to Mr. Koslovs and to start this conference on the international perspective on ethics in public administration. Mr. Koslovs.
Thank you, Fabrice. Again, welcome to those who joined just recently. Allow me to start with the words of Confucius. To see what is right and not to do it is a lack of courage or a lack of principle. According to him, not to act rightly is less of a problem than knowing what is right and not to do it. I would like to say that the majority of public servants in many situations actually know very well what is right, what is the right course of action, or it is clearly defined in the legislation, in the numerous codes, guidelines and manuals that all institutions in the public but also in the private sector actually have. Yet all too often they act in a different way, in pursuit of some other objectives, and thus putting at risk their organizations, their careers, and ultimately undermining the public trust in their organizations. I think you would all agree that in the recent years, the demand for public servants to know what is right and to act accordingly has been growing constantly. The same applies to scrutiny by the civil society and of the public of their actions. Therefore, I would say that the concept of too much, too early, or too late debate on ethics and integrity simply do not exist, because it is always timely, and your interest and participation at this conference very clearly demonstrates this. That is why in the recent years, the European Court of Auditors conducted a lot of work on governance matters in the public administration of the European Union. For example, we have published reports on the governance issues in the European Commission, European Union anti-fraud strategy, public consultations, and last but not the least, our special report on the ethical rules in the main European Union institutions. Such audits are difficult to perform, but they are very much needed because they address the high-risk areas where management failures result in major performance and reputational risks. So our intention today is to approach the issues of ethics and integrity from various angles, and the diversity of our panels, our sessions actually is a good guarantee for that. So we will cover international developments and aspects related more specifically to the European Union public administration. Our distinguished speakers, whom I thank again very much for being part of the conference sessions, will touch upon issues like building effective ethical rules in international organizations, various trade-offs that exist between regulatory approach and integrity building in organizations, legality versus reality. It's very topical question. The role of leadership, the role of leaders in the organizations, the role of audit institutions in the field of ethics and integrity. And this role does exist, but I could say that it is not a straightforward one. Behavioral aspects in the debate about ethics and integrity. For me personally, a question whether the main ethical principles need to be contingent upon the environment to which they apply seems worth discussing. In the second session, in the afternoon, we will focus on the main integrity developments in the EU administration. We will share the main findings of our report on the ethical frameworks in the EU institutions, but we will try to go beyond them and to touch upon issues like the need for a common ethical framework and an institution maybe in charge of these matters in the European Union, integrity culture in the European Union institutions and some dimensions thereof, like, for example, post-employment provisions or declarations of interest. How to deal with the violations, with the breaches of the ethical rules, how to prevent them so that they don't create very often unintentionally big damage to the image of the EU institutions. And last but not the least, the impact of the new ways of work in the post-COVID on ethics, integrity, and also transparency. So again, I would like to thank you for being here today. Stay connected, stay active, and I'm pleased now to invite our moderator, Fabrice, to launch the first session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Koslovs. The time has come to give our speakers, panelists, the floor. Allow me to first introduce our 5 speakers. We have Mrs. Ursula Wellen from the OECD, where she is the head of ethics. Mr. Nick Ayosa, Deputy Director and Head of EU Political Integrity at Transparency International. Mrs. Helena Abreu-Lopes, Chair of the Eurosci Working Group on Ethics. Ms. Tytti Ylli Viikari, Auditor General of Finland. And last but not least, Ms. Alina Mungiu-Pipidi, Professor of Democracy Studies at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Our first panel member is Dr. Ursula Wellen. She is the OECD's first head of ethics, where she took up her functions in March 2020. In her independent and impartial role as the head of ethics at the OECD, Dr. Wellen is responsible for monitoring and reporting on the effectiveness of the ethics framework, promoting awareness of ethical standards and advising staff at all levels, as well as the Secretary General on the ethical standards of the organization. She also oversees the OECD's recently reinforced whistleblower protection policy. Before, Dr. Wellen served as a political advisor on ethics at the United Nations Children's Fund. Dr. Wellen is specialized in law of the International Civil Service and previously held positions of increasing seniority in international institutions such as the EBRD, the OECD, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations. Dr. Wellem, may I ask you to turn on your camera and microphone, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabrice, for the very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to join this conference today. I think this is an amazing setting, and I'm so impressed by the number of people that you have managed to motivate and to participate. So that's really amazing. As you already mentioned, Fabrice, my role at OECD is a new role, and it's an inward-facing role in that I deal with standards of conduct and ethics amongst the staff of the OECD. OECD is, of course, very well known for its work on public integrity, but my role is not to work on the substantive outward-facing role, but so to speak, behind the scenes on the internal role on ethics and integrity amongst the OECD staff. However, in this role, it's at the same time crucially important not to have a siloed view or a tunnel view. So obviously in the international organizations, the standards of conduct are designed to work for the staff of an international organization, but at the same time, we need to be informed by and look out for what are the evolving standards and trends in the national public administrations. So in a sense, it's a two-way street. OECD develops officially as part of its mandates standards of conduct and rules about public integrity that are then taken up by its member states. But at the same time, inward, for the staff at OECD, we also need to be informed by what's deemed to be best practice in the National Civil Service. And that's an ongoing movement, I would say. It's important at the same time to also make sure that the International Civil Service remains impartial and independent from its member states. So just the fact that one particular member state has particular interest in one particular topic that's related to standards of conduct may not be sufficient, because then we could be putting our independence and impartiality at risk. So in a sense, it's a bit of a fine line to walk there. When I'm saying it's a two-way street, we need to still also preserve our independence and impartiality. Why is it important that we don't isolate ourselves from the standards that we promulgate for our member states? Let's say ILO, the International Labour Organization, has sometimes been criticized for developing standards, national labor law standards, that then internally at ILO were not at all implemented. And there was a concern that they didn't practice what they preach. And similarly, OECD also, when creating the position of the head of ethics, was conscious that this could be a concern that could be raised, because strengthening positions of ethics and whistleblower protection is something that OECD, of course, has been quote-unquote preaching and promulgating vis-a-vis its member states and outside. So in terms of internal credibility, it was important to create a role that reflects what OECD is also advocating for member states. And therefore, my privilege is, of course, that I can now, in my new role here as of ethics, draw on the amazing expertise that's already here in the house. As you know, in May 2020, OECD just published its handbook on public integrity. This is not something that I contributed to, but at the same time, I'm benefiting very much from the expertise of our colleagues. So when I'm organizing internal events, let's say webinar on whistleblower protection or webinar on how to strengthen internal integrity, then I automatically draw on the expertise of my colleagues here and make sure that they have a seat at the table, so that there is, if you want, cross-fertilization. That's something that I would also advocate for other international organizations. Make sure when you're working, quote unquote, behind the scenes, you don't forget that there is a world outside, and that you draw on existing expertise and don't try to reinvent the wheel. In that spirit, I would also like to acknowledge my colleague Peter Stockhoff, who works at in internal audit at the OECD, and there I can also say we, of course, practice what we preach in that sense also, because when you open the handbook on public integrity that OECD has published, they say on page 1 already, make sure you don't have a siloed approach, make sure that you work across the functions, and that's exactly what we're doing now internally also. So welcome, Peter. I'm delighted that you're also here listening in at the conference. And without further ado, back over to you, Fabrice. Happy to answer any questions on both on the newly created function, head of ethics at OECD, and also on how we develop our internal standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for these words on clearly the motto is practice what you preach, and I'm sure we'll get back to that a bit later in the debate. I would like now to introduce our second panelist. Nick Ayosa is the Deputy Director of Transparency International EU and leads the work on EU political integrity. He has been at Transparency International EU since 2014 and has worked on a variety of portfolios, including coordination of the movement's advocacy on the EU Whistleblower Directive. He has also worked on a variety of public accountability and the misuse of EU funds. Prior to working at Transparency International EU, he worked for over 6 years in the European Parliament on a range of topics, including human rights and transatlantic relations. Nick, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and particularly for the invitation to speak here today, and thank you for all the participants who have decided to tune in. I will be concise and brief because I'm actually looking forward to having more of a dialogue and exchange of views in the debate. As Fabrice said, I work at Transparency International, the international movement against corruption. I work in the EU office, and as such, we look at legislative change, administrative change, and I lead the team on political integrity, which looks at transparency, accountability within the EU institutions themselves. That includes both the political and staff levels. We look at issues around codes of conduct, conflicts of interest, lobby transparency, post-employment obligations or revolving doors, anti-fraud measures, and particularly most recently whistleblowing protections, given the passage of the directive and how it does not include in material or personal scope the EU institutions. I thought I would just briefly highlight some of the elements today of what we have found to be key in establishing proper ethical regulatory frameworks. In 2014, we carried out a series of studies looking at the institutions, looking at accountability mechanisms and transparency provisions. We are undertaking a second revision, looking at the Parliament, Commission, and the Council. And based on our work over the years and some of the initial findings from those studies, I want to highlight some of these elements of what we find are essential in having a proper functioning regulatory framework on ethics. First, we find it needs to be independent, well-resourced, and diligent oversight. Independent oversight is crucial. We have found that continually self or peer monitoring mechanisms don't work. And I must preface that I'm afraid, because I'm from the EU office and many of my examples to supplement these elements will obviously concern the EU institutions. For instance, in the European Parliament, the codes of conduct breaches are handled initially by the advisory committee in the Parliament, composed of exclusively MEPs, who make referrals for any kind of sanctions or disciplinary measures to the President of the Parliament exclusively, who has the right to deem it worthy of sanction or not. In the last legislative mandate, 24 MEPs were found to have breached the code of conduct, but none of them were sanctioned. Resources is key. The Joint Transparency Register, the EP and the European Parliament, European Commission, have to conduct quality controls, verify alerts, handle complaints concerning almost 12,000 lobby organizations, with roughly the equivalent of around 6 full-time employees. Oversight. We have found that there's little proactive control and monitoring mechanisms when it concerns such issues as declarations of financial interests or commissioners' post-employment activities. There's been a host of examples where either civil society or investigative journalists have uncovered breaches of both rules, leading to the fact that there might be a weakness in the system. We find that a proper sanctions regime must exist to serve as a deterrent for unethical behavior. In recent years, the French government established the French High Authority for Transparency, which, among other things, looks at declarations of financial interests and potential conflicts of interest. MEPs have a similar regime in place. French MEPs, beginning several years ago, had to correspondingly declare their financial interests both to the French government as well as the European Parliament. The comparative analysis of this was quite glaring. In the French system, if there was improper or falsified declarations, they would be subject to either criminal or administrative procedures. The Parliament does not have a corresponding sanctions regime for improper declarations or false declarations. And as such, you'll find that the level of details when you compared the same French MEP's declarations were stark and glaring. The implementation of any ethics regime must be credible and foster confidence in the system. The special report, which will be talked about a little bit later this afternoon, and which we welcome and widely share the findings, mentions whistleblowing as perhaps a weakness in the Parliament, specifically around accredited parliamentary assistants, which frankly is not surprising. According to the Parliament themselves, there were 3 whistleblower cases reported in 2016. All 3 were accredited parliamentary assistants of MEPs, and all were summarily dismissed. There were no whistleblower cases reported in 2017 nor 2018. What this shows us is that there's a lack of confidence in the system, and therefore people won't come forward and expose wrongdoing. All of this, of course, must be complemented by fostering a culture that promotes integrity. When building this culture, it's essential that there's a harmonized framework, that both elected officials and staff are held to the same ethical standards. Again, and I don't want to completely center around the Parliament, but given that there are some glaring problems when it comes to these standards, I will use an example of cooling off periods or post-employment obligations, where accredited parliamentary assistants, depending on the length of time served, are subject to cooling off periods when they leave the institutions. MEPs are not. You could have the chair of the economic committee leave their post and start lobbying for the financial industry the next day, whereas their same assistant, if they serve their requisite amount of time, wouldn't be able to do so. And then, of course, this leads us to, I think, what we have seen, and very thankfully, there's a growing motivation politically for this, is that we think that there needs to be an independent ethics body common to the 3 institutions. And we certainly are very pleased that the Commission President has proposed this within the political guidelines, and we, of course, will welcome working on this to make sure that some of the standards that I highlighted are obviously taken on board in the development of such a body or agency. I will leave it at that, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly, many of the points also very relevant for this afternoon's session. Nevertheless, they apply to all international organizations. I think need for independent, well-resourced oversight function body is obvious. Need for proactive control mechanisms, need for sanctions regime with implementation that needs to foster confidence in the system is the first messages I take from your intervention. Allow me now to introduce our third panel member. Helena Abreu-Lopes is a lawyer and has been a member of the Court of Auditors of Portugal since 2007. Before, she was Deputy Director General and Audit Manager in the same court. Ms. Lopez has a significant experience in public procurement audit and is now responsible for the audits in the areas of environment, natural resources, and European funding. Among other international cooperation work and responsibilities, she was a member of the ISAI 30, the Intosai Code of Ethics review team, and has been chairing the Eurosai Task Force on Audit and Ethics. This task force promotes cooperative work among European size Supreme Audit institutions in the field of ethics and audit, contributing to reinforcing, framing, and providing robustness to the management of ethical conduct within these institutions, and developing practical tools to help size in their ethics-related audit work. Helena, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the European Court of Auditors for having had this initiative for this interesting conference, and to Mr. Kozlovs for being our host in such an interesting program. I would also like to thank Fabrice for this kind introduction, and to say that I'm quite honored to participate in this initiative. In this very brief first intervention that we have, I would like to speak about 3 points very briefly. One, the role of the SAIs in the field of ethics and integrity. Two, the role model that Supreme Audit institutions play for the public sector. And third, some ethics requirements that Supreme Audit institutions have established for themselves. In the first item, the role of Supreme Audit institutions in the field of ethics and integrity, I think that we could all wonder why financial audit institutions that usually look into the use of public money should look into ethics. And I think that the answer is quite clear. Supreme Audit institutions are guardians of public governance in the use of public funds and the fulfillment of public policies, objectives. And this means that they look into the public sector activities to assess whether they respect rules, regulations, sound management principles, defined objectives and indicators, and of course, we cannot skip public interest, transparency, and integrity principles. SAIs can do this through their audit work, or they could adopt other approaches, such as awareness-raising activities, and in the discussions that Supreme Audit institutions have had among themselves, we may conclude that these institutions provide an added value in this field, but also that there is room for them to adopt more proactive approaches. As a second point, I would like to say that for Supreme Audit institutions to play such a role, they must also act in a way that is above reproach. They must be a model of ethical conduct. And so the Interzai Principle 12 mentions this when it states that Supreme Audit institutions should always act as a model. And in this field, we must speak about the international standard for Supreme Audit Institutions 130, the Code of Ethics of Interzai, that defines the standards that Supreme Audit institutions should follow in what relates to ethics. This Code of Ethics for Supreme Audit institutions was reviewed in 2016, as you mentioned, and it represents a significant progress in this area. SAIs all over are now taking steps to fully implement this standard. This standard adopts now an institutional perspective, making it clear that ethics is a commitment of the organization and not only of the individuals of the staff. So the staff must, the Supreme Audit institution, the organization, must create an integrity environment that encourages ethical behavior of staff. In this line, the standard describes responsibilities and requirements for the institution to guide, manage, and control ethical behavior. And among these responsibilities, it requires that supreme audit institutions implement a so-called ethics control system. And so what is the Supreme Audit Institution ethics control system? I said I didn't have a visual, but maybe I will use it now. Let me see if I can share it. Do you see it? Do you see a slide?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So an ethics control systems is a set of strategies, policies, and procedures. You can see here that there are a lot of them to promote and safeguard ethics in the Supreme Audit Institution. This integrity policy or system enhances that a code of conduct is just the basic element and not the only one. A code of conduct is not enough. We must be attentive and proactive to make sure it is actually implemented through a lot of other tools. And it also enhances that all the elements of this system lead to an integrity culture and not only to a compliance approach. The main components of these ethics control systems are the codes, the leadership, and then these three functions and tools to guide, to manage, and to monitor ethical behavior. And so I hope that I can come back to this in the discussion, but that these were the main messages that I would like to leave you to. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helena, for this presentation. The SAIs need to act in a way above reproach. There's an ISAI 130 Code of Ethics that defines the standards. Ethics is a commitment of the organization, as you said, and not only its staff. And of course, the environment needs to be there to encourage not only ethical behavior, but also to manage and to control it. Integrity culture is not, we need to build an integrity culture and not just only have a compliance framework. Thank you very much for this. I would like to introduce our fourth speaker this morning. Tytti Yli-Vikkari, I hope I pronounce this correctly, serves as the Auditor General of Finland since 2016. Prior to her nomination, she worked as Deputy Auditor General at the National Audit Office, and she has previously worked at the government's controller's function and the budget department of the Ministry of Finance. Ms. Yli-Vikkari is a public audit, public policy evaluation and risk management professional. She is driven by a strong will to enhance good governance and to develop relevant and timely information on public accountability. She regularly holds speeches in national and international seminars and themes such as digitalization, ethics, democracy, trust, and the future of public audit. She holds a Master in Public Administration from the French National School of Administration, ENA, and an MA's from the College of Europe and from the Panthéon-Sorbonne University. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Fabrice. And I think I will try to be concise, because I think both Helena, who took up the SAI perspective, and then Helena and Ursula and Nick, who also depicted what the integrity questions are about in our organizations, have well covered the scene. But let me take you back to ancient Greece. And so when Oedipus was met by a sphinx on the road to Thebes, he was posed the riddle, what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 in the evening? And while we ponder the answer that Oedipus gave, why I'm taking up the sphinx is that actually the ancient Greeks stole the concept or the legend of the Sphinx from the Egyptians. But in doing that, they also changed the character of the Sphinx. So the Egyptians saw the Sphinx as a very benevolent creature, whereas for the Greek, it was a malevolent creature, which would cause a lot of harm and death amongst the citizens. So this shows to us that what is good and what is bad, or what is considered as right and wrong, changes from context to the other, from a generation or a society to another. And so this is my first point. Each generation, and therefore also each generation of public servants, will reshape the concepts around morality and behavior, integrity and ethics. And if we then go to, well, what is good behavior? What is seen as good behavior? I will not quote, but I will make a reference to the philosopher Levinas, who in the mid-1990s or 2019s considered that any action can be redeemed as good if its consequences, so the consequences of the action, are good. Whereas if the consequences are bad, then that behavior can be seen as bad behavior. So this is the second point. Whatever we do or we decide to do is good behavior if it can be seen as good by others. And this we can see in a very simple example. In the Finnish administration, we often face the issue of conflict of interest. And we have had high officials who have had to step down because of a conflict of interest where their own feeling about how they were involved, for example, in a decision of which consequences were very beneficial for their relatives, they could feel that they had not been part of that decision-making process, but others would see that their presence in the decision-making process was already influence. Similarly, we just recently had a case where a government minister decided to step down because the media portrayed her use of public funds as something of not good character. So whereas the public funds use was seen, it was cleared, it was seen as there was no compliance issue as such, the media portrayed this in a light which shed a public blame on the person, and she decided to step down. So what we do is not sufficient when we're considering integrity questions. It's how that action is seen by others that actually is part of the integrity dilemma. And of course, well, how do we know then if what is good and what is seemed as good or bad changes from a society to another, from a context to another? How do we know how our actions as public servants will actually be seen by the society at large, or even just our peers and our colleagues in the institution we work in? Well, we need to have a dialogue. We need to have an updated dialogue, and it's not sufficient, in my view, to have a code of conduct only presented to the new staff when they start in an institution. Because we see with the VUCA environment, so the very volatile, unexpected, complex and ambiguous environment we now do policy making in, we see that situations change and the context and the criteria against which we actually see other people's actions change very rapidly. So it means that we need to take integrity issues as a call for a society-wide dialogue. And this is actually very well portrayed in the 2017 OECD recommendation on public integrity. That recommendation says that integrity is essential for building strong institutions and assures citizens that the government is working in their interest, not just for the select few. Integrity is not just a moral issue, it is also about making economies more productive, public sectors more efficient, societies and economies more inclusive. It is about restoring trust, not just trust in government, but trust in public institutions, regulators, banks, and corporations. So when we're talking about ethics and integrity, we're actually talking about trust. and how trust in our societies is very vulnerable to also how we as public servants exercise our power. One last example from the Finnish governance system. We now have a new program called Aurora AI, which is actually an artificial intelligence tool. The aim of it is to go on social media platforms and see citizens, for example, youth, who are in need of public service. So that service could be employment services or educational services, basically to not just think that actually the citizens will come to the agencies, but be present where the citizens are. So a tendency we have now in many administrations where we're talking about customer centricity or participatory methods. So this Aurora AI poses a dilemma to its programmers. Who and through which process is capable of saying that one choice is better than the other for the youth? How do we code, how do we program artificial intelligence to make those kind of decisions which will actually have a consequence on our citizens' path in society? How do we say, from an ethical perspective, if it's better for the youth to go into this or that employment service, to go into this or that educational platform? And this is just the start of the new ethical novel questions that public servants will face when we actually adopt more and more machine learning and artificial intelligence in our governance processes. Similar issues we've had already with privacy issues on data management, and therefore I would argue that the overall governance model needs to encompass ethical and integrity questions, because this will become more and more part of our daily work. We will not be able to legislate or to be able to have guidance that will cover all issues that come out of the new digital era. Technology poses that question to governments. We talk about this creepy line of where what is possible is not what we want to do. So not everything that's technologically possible, for example, for governments, will be something that the society will see as good. So coming back to this debate on integrity and the question of, well, for auditors, we need to enlarge the question from was it done right to were the right things done? So for this, we have very good tools. As Helena pointed out, we have all kinds of audit tools broadening the question from just oversight to insight and foresight. And therefore, I would say that it's not just about materiality. It can also be about, as Helena pointed out, the tone at the top or the culture of an organization, which will show, well, how are these integrity issues dealt with in the overall management of that institution? So coming back to the Sphinx and the question, of course, the answer to the Sphinx riddle was man, because man crawls as a baby, walks on 2 legs as an adult, and uses a walking stick in his twilight years. And public sector integrity encompasses all these very different needs, from the most vulnerable to the most agile citizens. Auditors, we are very well positioned to see the society-wide considerations and perspective on ethics and integrity. And for that, I think auditors are also very keen on engaging in these kind of discussions and public dialogue on how to debate on ethics and how to make that into a continuous public debate. On that, thank you, and looking forward to good discussion.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Quite a lot of things. We could talk about the Sphinx and the riddle, and also the consequences of behavior that will define the good or bad of a behavior. The perception of conflict of interest was raised. I think one key phrase here for supreme audit institutions is the question, was it done right, is the first way of looking at things. And of course, were the right things done being the second question, which would be like the second step into the future. The issue of artificial intelligence and that not all technical possibilities will be perceived as good for the citizens and by its users. Quite a lot of issues that we would like to discuss and raise, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm getting nervous because I see that we're almost half through this and we haven't actually started the real debate yet. Without putting any pressure to our last speaker that I would like to welcome is Alina Mungiu-Pipidi. She is a professor of democracy studies at Hertie School in Berlin and also chairs the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building. She is the author of A Quest for Good Governance, How Societies Build Control of Corruption, and also author of Europe's Burden, Promoting Good Governance Across Both Borders. She has also authored many journal articles. She published in Nature, the world's leading scientific publication, and policy reports. She also consulted with the World Bank, UNDP, the International Monetary Fund, the European Parliament, the Swedish government, the EU Commission, and the EU Council Dutch Presidency, among others. Her research projects funded by both the EU and American donors resulted in comments such as Europam.eu on European Public Accountability Mechanisms or OpenTender.eu on making public tenders more transparent, or the well-known Integrity Index. Now, I've spoken more than enough. I give the floor to Mrs. Alina Mungiu-Pipidi, please.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation and this kind introduction. I was asked, since I am by my basic training a social psychologist before becoming a political scientist and a little bit of a historian in later years, I was asked to explain why corruption comes about and psychologically, actually, what happens, how can we deter corruption. Well, I would put it like this, with the risk of being a little bit provocative, is that what I discovered in my studies when I tried to look how does control of corruption get built, how does public integrity come about, to discover that actually, you know, in many ways, this is the wrong question to put. I mean, the question is not how does somebody who has power become corrupt? But the real question is, why doesn't it happen more often? Why do people manage to restrain what is, you know, by default, selfish and self-indulgent behavior that we all have as humans? We have to really travel back and relaxedly to when we were children, and the regulation was that it was only one slice of cake for each of us if you were more than one children. But the reason we didn't take one more slice of cake is simply that our little brother would protest or mother will see us. Otherwise, it is really in our nature to take the extra cake, even if we know that it's just one cake that we are entitled. And why does it not happen more often? And why doesn't it happen more often in certain countries, is that at the end of a very long historical evolution, a system is built by which constraints by others, other people who look at us when we do things, right? And a better control of opportunities, like less cakes lying around on tables to tempt us, we manage to arrive at this balance, at this equilibrium, which is public integrity. And therefore, you know, when many people look at this problem as a problem of how to find an exceptional individual who is exceptionally wrong and vicious and a deviant, I think that the problem should be turned completely around and rather think, what are the kind of contexts which in fact prevent us, which reduce this kind of opportunities? When you have this kind of opportunities, it really doesn't matter from what culture you come from. Any of you who worked in Kosovo, or you can read the story of Kosovo in this last book of mine, Europe's Burden, you would see this funny Balkan titles, a newspaper title, for instance, saying we did not manage to Europeanize Kosovo, but we managed to Balkanize EULEX, which was the EU legal arm in Kosovo, which after fighting corruption had become fairly corrupt itself in just the space of a few years. So if you have a context where opportunities are rife, there's simply too many cakes lying around, and where constraints are very low, you will discover that very many people, I would not say everybody, but quite significant number of people yield to temptation. Psychologically, we know that corruption is actually, corrupt behavior or integrity behavior are roughly a function of conformity. So if individuals are in an environment where integrity is very high, they will tend to conform to that environment and they will behave as honest people. However, if the opposite applies, if you are in an environment where, on the contrary, conflict of interest is rife, or profit from conflict of interest is rife, or bribe taking is rife, most individuals will actually fall in with the environment. Because under systematic corruption is not an individual thing, it's a system. And then, it takes you more courage to defect from the system and stand aside from your peers and say, okay, but I do not want to belong to this organization, rather than fall in and do what everybody else does. And that, I think, has quite important policy consequences on how we address corruption. International organizations in particular are very prone to disequilibria, because what would exist in a normal country, in this historically built equilibrium, where citizens really, through journalism and through civil society and through elections, manage to control the rulers and defend themselves from abuse of office, this seldom exists in international organizations. I mean, if FIFA were a country, for instance, let's think a little bit like FIFA or like UN before Oil for Foods. The problem was that there was no demand for good governance. There was no accountability in these organizations. Who were the people? Well, the people were the countries which were members. But if you look at what was the norm in those countries, you will discover that in a majority of those countries, the norm was corruption and integrity was an exception. And therefore, there was no way that this kind of members could hold these organizations. I mean, OECD, of course, it's a smallest organization. Most of its members are very developed countries. I mean, all of them are developed countries. But I would say that the majority of them have enjoy a very good control of corruption in countries, although not all. And for every organization which enlarges to different stages of development, countries, it faces the risk that it will have a weak constituency for integrity. There will be nobody to put up demand for integrity, right? And then the demand will get itself like, Transparency International Brussels office and other few organizations like this, which are not like a country, are not like voters who can bring you down, are far weaker organizations, even if they try to play a role. Now, what I think the solution is out of this, when we look at it, is that I think we have to envisage that two kinds of solutions are needed. One solution is where the integrity context is right, opportunities for corruption are limited and well controlled, but we don't have many situations like that. I don't want people to feel encouraged. And constraints for corruptions are relatively high, and then indeed only spectacular exceptions will take place, like the Danish tax fraud case, where only one individual, due to digitalization and the early retirement of colleagues, he was left absolutely by himself with absolutely no peers and no oversight to reimburse tax dividends. And, this is how it happened. Since he was absolutely by himself, he was approached by somebody, by a private company, and this is how the corruption circles started. And this is really a very clear lesson, is that nobody should be the uncontrolled, having this extraordinary power of returning dividends of 1 million per hour, I think it reached at a certain moment. Because everyone, or nearly everyone, again, will yield to temptation. But I think that's not such a frequent situation, and after all, I think that this is a very easy situation to handle. I mean, when corruption is an exception, it's really very easy to organize against it. What is really a problem is when corruption seems to be rather the norm, All right, and it seems to me that we as Europeans really underestimate the situations where corruption is a norm. I think our colleague from Transparency International pointed out and in the previous work that in fact revolving doors at the EU, at Brussels level may be a norm and not an exception. And therefore, we won't be able to control it by public management tools. We will have to have reforms. There's no other way of dealing with systemic corruption than reforms. Repression or just this kind of administrative oversight would not work. And just a slide, if I can share with you, and I am done, is that we have to re-examine a little bit our European context. We really take it for granted that we are still in the situation where corruption is a norm, and we indeed very successfully as Europeans managed to sell to the rest of the world our ethical norms. Look at poor people in Lebanon. They go out and they say, we do not want a government divided by factions. We want everybody to be treated equally and fairly. I mean, these are the classic European modern norms of governance. Now everybody have adopted them. But in the same time, while everybody have adopted them, we have to be aware that particularly in times of economic scarcity, these norms are in danger even in Europe. What you see on the screen, I hope you see this on the screen, are the top Foreign Corrupt Practice Act settlements. In other words, companies which confessed to corruption and settled outside courts paying these very huge fines. And you would see that out of these top 10 settlements, all but 3 are European Union companies. And some of them are public companies or semi-public companies. You know, Airbus with a record fine of 4 million, Telia, which is a semi-public Swedish company. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, don't we really overestimate our environment? And in particular in time like this, wouldn't it be better that we reduce a little our expectations and discuss a little bit more openly, not wait until a case comes out like Airbus in courts, and then we find out that everybody, not just the company, but all the regulators, a lot of people knew about it, like in Germany now with Wirecard, turned out that regulators in fact were trading Wirecard shares. Right, but this was known. It's quite impossible that something which was like mass behavior was not known. So I think we need reforms, but in order to get to reforms, I think we have to have a very open discussion where we understand that we align the whole world to our norms, which is a fantastic European success, but meanwhile we are ourselves losing on our good practices, and we have to catch up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. How to deter corruption? Why do people restrain from selfish behavior? Good point. Certainly also for debate. It goes back to childhood. The story of the cake, I think, was quite revealing. But many people yield to temptation, and they conform to the environment, and they are in. If it's the integrity environment is high, integrity probably will prevail. If corruption is high, well, that will then prevail. A few questions, of course. One question that comes up more than a few, just one. I'd say, do we overestimate our environment as being on the good road to integrity? I think this is a very important question that we all deal with in a way or another in our different activities and functions. Well, I think this brings us to the end of the individual presentations from our panelists and speakers. I would like to invite the 5 of them to now turn on their camera as we will open the discussion. I have seen that there are a few people already asking for the floor, and also some people asking if the slides presented by both Helena and Alina could be shared. We can look into that afterwards. If you agree to do so, we can find a way that we here from the court make it available on the website of this conference. Now, before giving the floor to all the participants and asking, or actually trying to provide answers, I would like to ask actually a first very general question, actually triggered by the last intervention. We all think that we are on the way to integrity. We have different ethical frameworks, different ethical culture, or at least ethical guidelines. We have sometimes mechanisms to control them, etc. And are we actually overestimating what we are doing? Is there actually a safeguard that we can look in the mirror and say, is this actually good, or is it just a facade? Is this just making us feel okay? We have some ways, but where are we going with this? Would anyone like to start on this from the panel?
Actually, if you wouldn't mind, I just have an initial thought, and it also relates to what I should have prefaced before my intervention, is that even though my examples concern the EU institutions and highlighting some of the weaknesses, the actual ethical framework of the EU institutions is very strong. And the weaknesses that we have seen, and this maybe speaks to the facade, is the implementation of those frameworks. The rules are in place. It's just how are they implemented, how are they interpreted, and how are they communicated to both staff and elected officials. And at least in Brussels, I have found over the years that there is a bit of a facade, and there's a comfort that some of the institutions have wrapped themselves in knowing that on paper the rules are good and they're strong. And then when things go wrong, they refer back to, but we have these rules in place, but it's just the implementation is the problem. And so the weaknesses that we have discovered, I'd say the majority of them are simply around this issue of, is the institution willing to implement, carry out the rules, and it really has to do around some of the sanctioning and discipline measures. And I find that it has less to do around staff and more to do around the political levels. I mean, do the staff, and this maybe comes back also to the point of the need for an independent oversight agency. Does the staff have confidence to take potential actions and against a commissioner or an elected MEP who have breached the rules? And we have found that usually the answer is no.
Okay. Anyone else would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I would also say that it's crucial that there's some form of visible accountability. Yeah. So we had in my previous organizations a lot of discussions around that. When people have engaged in misconduct, then at least in the International Civil Service, it's not possible to publicly name and shame people. Yeah, at least not. Maybe if it comes out in the public domain, you may find it in a newspaper. But internally, the internal justice system doesn't allow you to say, well, Ursula Wörn engaged in such and such misconduct, and therefore we have imposed the following sanction. Yeah, and therefore there's sometimes also a perception amongst staff of lack of accountability. And what works well is if you have at least an aggregated reporting system where both the member states and the staff know, well, we had these cases of proven misconduct, and here are the sanctions. You don't put in the names, and maybe you put in the ranks of the people, and you detail what it is, and people read this very attentively. Yeah. So that having a credible accountability mechanism. I give a very minor example. In one organization I joined, and they told me, oh, we have a mandatory online training system, and ethics is mandatory, like and I was the ethics advisor myself. And then a whole period of time passed, and I still hadn't done it. And I felt worse every day I was coming into the office. And I finally asked someone, how do you actually keep track whether people have been doing their mandatory online training? And it turned out it wasn't monitored by anyone. So we postulated initially that the training was mandatory, but if you didn't do it, there was no accountability, no sanction. And I think that sends, even though it's a small detail, it still sends a powerful message. The more people discover that small trespasses do not have any consequences, the more psychologically they may be inclined to then engage in the next step and say, well, nothing happened here. What happens if I go a little bit further, if I push the envelope a little bit further? So I very much agree with Nick that just having the written rules is really just a start. Thank you, and over.
Okay, thank you, Ursula. Any more comments or additions?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I was just as a follow-up of this, I want to recall to everybody an example of a few years ago when the Panama Papers broke up and the situation came up with the Prime Minister of Iceland that he kept the money of his family in some offshore. And this came up in the evening, and he was still saying the next morning at 9 that he broke no rule, there was nothing illegal, which was absolutely true. That he didn't break any rule by Icelandic law. Nothing was illegal. Nevertheless, the whole of Reykjavik was in the main central square that morning to ask him to go because it was judged to be a completely unethical situation. He had asked everybody to keep their money in Iceland to prop up their national bank, and then he had secretly had the money of his family outside. And by noon he was gone. He had to resign and he left. This is the power of normative constraints, and this is what enforces integrity. Our actions such as this, if rules and many rules would be the one to deliver integrity, then we would find that organizations with the most rules or countries with most anti-corruption or public accountability legislation have the best control of corruption. But what we find is actually the opposite. We find that countries such as Finland or Netherlands or countries which are handling corruption really well, in fact, have very scarce integrity frameworks. I mean, I perfectly understand why at EU institutions we have to ask them for rules because the constituency of European Parliament is very far away. But nevertheless, when we keep bounding up rules, piling up rules on top of one another, we have to understand that what we will deliver are more and more implementation gaps. Because otherwise, this is a very old knowledge. The Romans had a word which said the most corrupt republics have the most laws. I have the statistical evidence to prove this. So what we need to increase are constraints, which, by the way, transparency delivers. More and more people see what you do. To increase this kind of normative constraints, others see you and blame you, even if it's not necessarily that you broke a rule, and it would take years of trial to show where you did get wrong. And of course, this is the difficulty of international organizations because settings like this don't really exist very well, or transparency is simply insufficient. But I would say, that more transparency towards outsiders, that other people can see you, rather than more ethical codes are going to help, because otherwise I cannot think of any corrupt organization which doesn't already have an ethical codes and is very confidently, breaking it every day.
Thank you very much. I would just like to remind. I know the temptation is big. Sorry, to use the chat to pose a question, but we'd like to have people online and actually see them. So before I give the floor to the first persons for asking questions, Titi, you wanted to comment further on this point, please.
Thank you very much. And I think Alina made a brilliant point coming from Finland. What we are now currently grappling with is that our civil service staff will be renewed in the next 4 years. So half of the civil service staff will actually be renewed within the next 4 years. This is a huge challenge for an organization or a governance where we have based our actions on trust. So as Alina says, Finland is one of the countries which is often cited as, number one in anti-corruption statistics. We have certainly the fewest rules or control systems, and we have been basing our integrity frameworks on trust. This used to be the case where we had a very homogeneous population working in the civil service. Now the society is much more heterogeneous. So we have people from diverse origins, from diverse belief systems, from diverse social patterns and social frameworks. And the social pressure and what is considered to be a good life or what is considered to be wrong and right, looking from the inside out. So what is more hedonistic, what is more beneficial for you personally, and then what is more societally acceptable, all those concepts are changing. And this is extremely important because now we're looking at if we would have to, as a governance system, if we would have to build anti-corruption measures, control frameworks, more staff to control other staff. For example, the SAI in Finland is one of the smallest in numbers of staff in the world relative to the population. It would cost us too much. We are not able to build a system which will be controlling itself to the extent where those implementation gaps that Alina was talking about would be covered. So we have to base it on the social norms, on education, on learning, on inciting people to conduct themselves in an ethical manner. And what are the ethical codes that we should adopt here? Those are not the same as 20 years ago or 40 years ago. Some of the basic elements are there. But today, more than just having a regulation on financial transactions, which are very far in Finland controlled automatically, because the whole financial service system is automated. So there are, integrated controls. People don't need to be controlled because the computers, the machines do it. We have to actually control issues such as, well, is some policy area not active enough? Are there some decisions that are lagging behind? Is there some legislation that should be, proposed but is not proposed? And these new issues linked to the digital age are actually becoming bigger ethical questions than the sole use of public funds for one's personal wealth, for example. So I think we are also facing, and Finland is a prime example, we are also facing a situation where the more typical integrity issues linked to the use of public funds or the use of a powerful position will also give room to the more society-wide concerns about what is actually in the pipelines in decision making. Are the more vulnerable actors in society taking into account? What about those who don't have a voice and so forth? So there's a new era, I think, also linked to public sector integrity, and that's why I made reference to the OECD recommendation on integrity, because it has a society-wide aspect on what is integrity.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Helena, you wanted to say something? Yes.
Thank you so much. I would like to I'm thinking about from the point of view of a small organization like a Supreme Audit Institution, but I think that my worry also applies to the bigger organizations or to the society or even to the international organizations, and we have here some representatives of international organizations. We may have norms, we may have tools, and the question is we have to implement them, and we have to take care of monitoring and having more transparency or more accountability and having a proactive role. But there is, I think, an underlying issue is either we have a lot of ethical norms or a few of them. We have a problem which is a common understanding. We say that what is good is what the others see as good, but there are many us and many others and many different opinions on what is good, and how do we build in our organizations or in our societies a common understanding on what is the right conduct. And my experience is that this is so difficult because all people have a different opinion on what is the right conduct to have or the right interpretation of a standard or of a norm, either it is detailed or a general one. So I think that we have to put a lot of attention in our organizations to set common understandings And that brings us to soft controls of discussing, and being very open to discussion in order to create as much as possible a common understanding of what is right and what is wrong.
Thank you, Elena. Nicholas, you wanted to add something?
Yes. I just wanted to chip in very quickly and actually pick up on the last point made by Helena, that discussion is key. I think many of you, actually all of you, converged on the need to have an environment which is conducive to ethical behavior. And unless you discuss, which is one of the awareness creation instruments, tools, you cannot arrive at this. I think there was also an interesting concept put forward by Ursula, visible accountability, which is something that actually would show to the organizations and to the broader public that the system actually works. But then you also discussed, some of you put forward a point that too much controls actually is very costly. So how to make sure that this accountability actually takes place, because you cannot ensure accountability unless you have underlying solid system of controls in organization. And then there's always a question of risk and benefits that is also very often brought in the discussion also by the European organization, but also beyond. So I think we have here a very interesting debate, which brings some new ideas, but also shows some contradictions that are there if we want to achieve several objectives at the same time in this area. So I will stop here and pass the floor back to Fabrice for the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like actually to open the floor, and before taking the questions that were in the chat, is there anybody that would like to ask a question right now directly to any of the panelists, or more in general? From the audience, so request for speaking. I don't see any sign. Yes, I then follow. Yeah, so then I go back in the list, and I see that the very first request for the floor was from Mose Appelblatt from the Brussels Times. Mose, the floor is yours. I don't know if you could switch on your camera and microphone.
Yes. Yes, can you hear me, Fabrizio?
Yeah, I can hear and see you. Hello.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I mean, the first question, and I think it was very interesting to listen to all of you, and let's say the issues are very much related, I would say. And I just would ask, let's say, 2 or 3 questions, maybe they are addressed to all of them, to all the speakers. Okay, the first one on whistleblowing, especially whistleblowing protection. I think that was raised by Nick, and he mentioned some examples for the European Parliament. I got the impression that while, let's say, EU member states have largely, let's say, introduced whistleblower protection, it's not been done sufficiently in the EU institutions, and that surprised me a bit. And what I especially would like to ask Nick is, when, let's say, internal disclosure doesn't function, which it obviously didn't do in the Parliament, what about external disclosure to media? Is that something protected, say, by the rules in the Parliament and institutions? About the media also, I would be surprised listening to Finland, to the Auditor General in Finland, because she mentioned an example of a minister who had to, let's say, resign because what media wrote about him, about his use or misuse of public funds, which was not obviously true, and that seemed to have become a kind of witch hunt, and I would be surprised about that if you could explain it. And last but not the least, about ethics as a separate audit norm. Here's my question. We know we have the 3 so-called E's, let's say, the norms against which the Supreme Audit institutions carry out the audits, right? I mean, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. But what about ethics? Are there any sites who also has included that, let's say, in the mandates to look at ethics, which is a kind of gray area, I suppose, every time they're carrying out an audit? Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. So actually 3 questions for 3 of the panelists, and of course others feel free to join in. The first one would go to Nick about the whistleblowing protection and that not sufficiently is done in the institutions. Now, without wanting to debate too much on the EU institutions perspective, which is more the focus of this afternoon's session, but please, Nick, if you could address this issue.
Sure, and I will try to be brief. As many of you know, the EU has recently adopted a comprehensive directive on whistleblowing that will cover both the public and private sectors. That is being transposed now and set to be finished transposition later next year. Unfortunately, the EU institutions are not covered by this directive, one, because it's not the right legal instrument. Having said that, under the staff regulations, EU staff are in theory protected if they want to disclose wrongdoing in institutions. There are several problems, though, with the scheme. One is that the staff regulation only touches upon this briefly in several articles and leaves it up to the individual institutions to come forward with their own rules and guidelines. What we have seen when looking across in a comparative way, they range, they're not harmonized, and their actual provisions vary as far as quality and the levels of protection. For instance, I'll give you one very quick example on anonymous reporting. In the Commission, the internal guidelines highly discourages anonymous reporting. Of course, Olaf, which is structurally part of the Commission, encourages anonymous reporting, as they should, and has an online platform that can receive reports of wrongdoing and misuse of EU funds. The Parliament's internal rules explicitly ban anonymous reporting, and staff members who come forward anonymously and are later revealed identity will not be protected. You mentioned media specifically. Again, I think that there's a tragic irony here, where the absolutely fantastic team in the Commission who drafted the proposal wrote and drafted a proposal that gave higher standards of protection, knowing that they wouldn't be covered by it. And media is one of them. Under no circumstances under the rules are staff members allowed to go externally to the media. Under certain very strict conditions, they can go externally through institutions, either through the Secretary General or to the Ombudsman. But again, it is an example of why there needs to be a revision, because I think at the very heart of it, whistleblowing protection establishes the necessary framework, not only culturally, but regulatorily. I mean, if you can't allow staff members to feel confident about exposing ethical breaches or fraud or corruption, then nothing else can follow. And I know that over the years we've had whistleblowers come into the office, walk-ins, mostly from the Parliament, and mostly assistants, who don't feel protected. We of course refer them to Olaf, but oftentimes they simply don't have the confidence that if they're discovered, their identity, that they'll be protected. And I think this is one of the largest failings that we see across the institutions.
Thank you, Nick. The following question was about the risk of witch hunting with the example of the Finnish minister. Titi, perhaps you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, so my point was actually the same as in Alina's example of the Icelandic case, where what the minister had done had little to do with, you know, how it looked from the outside given a specific context. And so this is where we have the limits of compliance audits, for example, or of compliance measures, where we cannot as individuals think that just because I know I did nothing wrong, you know, somebody else might just see my action in a given context as something that would be interpreted as being wrong behavior. And that was basically my point. The point is, in that specific case, and there are many, of course, in the history of politics, more so maybe in some of the northern countries where transparency around the use of public funds is extremely open. So you can see all of the procurement data of the government online in real time. So there's no issue of having that data. So if the media takes up an issue, and then in the Finnish case on Twitter, it went on for a few days until the minister thought that it would be, this is my interpretation, bad for her party, bad for the government, and decided to step down in order to kind of, you know, stop the public outcry over a sum of money which, relatively speaking, was very, very small, and in a case where there were no compliance issues with that procurement action. So it's just to show, once again, what we do is not sufficient to look from our own perspective. It's always in a given context, and others' view of our action is actually what will determine how that will be seen in society as regards to integrity and ethical questions.
Thank you very much. And then the last question that probably would be directed first to our experts from the sides here, Tytti and Helena, about the 3 E's, of course, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. The 4th E being ethics. Of course, there's the ISAI 130 and others, but I would give you the floor if you have any further points to raise or suggestions on this 4th element, I would say, of the task of auditors and external auditors.
Okay, Tytti, do you want to start, or should I? Okay, I think that I covered that issue in my first intervention. You asked how many SAIs have included ethics in their role or in their mandate. First of all, after discussing a lot over this, we Supreme Audit institutions mostly think that we don't need to have a specific mandate to look into ethics in public sector organizations, because ethics is a part of good governance, and Supreme Audit institutions have this general mandate of looking into how the use of public funds have complied with good governance principles. And so integrity is one of them. Secondly, how many SAIs have done that, have included an ethical approach in their work? There is not a symmetric approach on this on SAIs. Some have done it, some have not done it, but we can list some examples. For instance, there are Supreme Audit institutions that have looked into ethical frameworks of public sector organizations, such as the case of the European Court of Auditors in this report that will be discussed in the afternoon. There are others that have looked into ethics-related issues, such as audit reports about the whistleblowing arrangements in the public administrations, the gifts and hospitality arrangements. There is an interesting report on lobbying from the Austrian Court of Auditors. There are also reports on nepotism. In our case, for instance, we have just finished a report on how to prevent ethical breaches in humanitarian aid. And related to the crisis of COVID-19, we can also find some examples of undergoing audits, for instance, about the prevention of corruption in public procurement of medical supplies, or as for instance, in Latin America, some Supreme Audit institutions are looking into the reliability of the epidemiological data, which is also a source of corruption. It may be a source of corruption, because it may be publicized according to interests and not according to truth. So these are some examples of approaches that Supreme Audit institutions have used.
Thank you. Tytti, would you like to comment further on that?
I think Helena did an outstanding job in giving the overview of what we already do. Now, I would like to just add that on the use of data and the use of artificial intelligence, namely this black box thing, if we are not able to say and to explain to citizens why a certain public decision was made, which had consequences for their health or for their well-being or for their substantially affecting their lives, where's the responsibility? And I think here the Dutch SAI, the Rekenkamer, they have started an audit on the use of artificial intelligence or algorithms in public administration. And of course, this is all about, who gets to decide on issues of relevance for citizens. And I think many SAIs have this good governance backbone, but are also reaching out to the impact of policy making on citizens and trying to reach out to citizens to have citizen participation also in their audits. And this is a trend that we can also trace back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where of course we have the mission of leaving no one behind. And that gives an ethical dimension to all public sector work, which goes beyond what we are also discussing here, which is the level of personal gain or personal power or personal benefits that one could get from having a public position. But now we're talking about, well, how do we take into account the most vulnerable parts of our societies and who actually become vulnerable parts of societies in the age of use of algorithms or data management in government. So I think we're talking at different levels of integrity questions and ethical questions. SAIs are more used to working with the imminent problem of financial management, the use of public funds, but we are increasingly reaching out to the other ethical dimension, which is, well, how do we make public decisions? How do we prepare government bills? How does the administration use information? And how does that impact society and the civil society at large?
Thank you very much. All right, I suggest we take the next question. From what I've seen on the list, we have Mike Burnett from the European Institute on Public Administration. Mike, could you please turn on your camera and microphone? Mike, can you hear us? Let me see. No? Hello, hello? No. Okay. I see that Mike has made more comments in the chat, but we can't hear you, Mike. So I'll take another question that was actually posted on the chat from Maria Luisa Sanchez Barueco from the University of Deusto. Would you like perhaps to turn on your camera and microphone and ask the question?
Hi, good morning. Hello, good morning from Bilbao. I wanted to congratulate you on an excellent conference. It was really inspiring. My question my question is put forward from the perspective of academia and external observer to European institutions, and I wanted to highlight that. My impression that at times it seems that European institutions, supranational institutions, are reluctant to defend themselves against or from the individuals who take profit of their role in leadership to exploit it for the personal benefit. And I wanted to ask the panelists perhaps if they can put forward criteria to strike a balance between personal privacy or individual privacy concerns and the overall institutional legitimacy concerns. Because in the end, when the individual misbehaves, it is the whole institution who suffers. However, the citizens do not perceive that the institution has defended itself, as somebody said previously. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Anybody would like to start on this from the panel? Yes, Ursula, please. And then turn on your microphone, please. We can't hear you.
Yes, the traditional perspective in the international civil service is, of course, that there is no public accountability. So because of these privacy concerns, people may be exposed to disciplinary sanction, people may even be asked to leave an organization, but it's not something that can be publicized. And I understand that, especially when it's people of greater seniority, that this can have institutional legitimacy repercussions, because the perception is, oh, these people were allowed to leave the organization quietly without being publicly held accountable. That's my experience, still an unresolved issue and an ongoing journey. Because the traditional, people have brought cases then saying, oh, my reputation was damaged, and then the last thing you want is that the senior person then still gets some kind of financial reward based on a judgment by an administrative tribunal of the respective international organization saying, yes, you ruined their professional reputation without taking into concerns their privacy. So the traditional approach is to allow people to leave quietly, even when they've been terminated. What has been happening, however, is then what do you do if they then go to another international organization because the data is not available and the new organization doesn't even know that they left their previous organization under cloud. So in these instances, then at least there has been a system of exchange of information between the international organizations so that they can, if they do cross-reference checking, then at least one organization is able to say, well, we do not recommend that you hire this person again. But that's still different from public accountability. So maybe the other speakers have further insights on this topic, how this can be addressed, but within the international organizations, at least at the current time, I don't see that's resolved as an issue yet. Thank you, and over.
Alina, please, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, I think we are very lucky to be in Europe, with this question on how to balance public integrity versus privacy. We are in Europe, we all live in rule of law countries with a very high degree of public safety. And I say that because last time when I was asked to give input to this one was when Mexico was adopting its financial disclosures and assets disclosure statements. And of course, civil society and the media lobbied for having transparent asset disclosures. And politicians resisted by saying that Mexico is a country where there are a lot of kidnappings, and if they would go and publish their assets and on their income, they would become targets for kidnappers. Which, of course, sounds like a sensible argument, except that kidnapping in Mexico also refers to very petty people, not just to top people who can afford security. Now, what I think is that in Europe, people who have positions in offices which can be abused, resulting in money being wrongly allocated, or injustice is being done should waive these concerns to privacy. And these financial disclosures and assets disclosures and conflict of interest disclosures should all be posted online for everybody to be able to see. And, you know, presently we only have a few countries who do that. Other countries don't have financial disclosures at all. Some of them, I don't think they need them. I mean, maybe Denmark, if the Danes consider that they do not need it, they do not need it. But countries which have introduced this, they should make it entirely transparent, because after all, you have to pay a cost for power. And I think that allowing other people to look into your assets, even if it looks like a breach of privacy, is something that you should give in. Just think that Europe has promoted this financial disclosures to countless countries where we give aid, and because this was part of both European and in particular World Bank conditionality. So now we have tens of countries which have adopted these, and these countries didn't question this very much. We find, however, that these only seem to be effective in countries where there is freedom of the press. So again, what matters is not so much filling in your assets and financial disclosures so that people see how much money do you have when you leave office compared to what you entered, but the fact that this can be checked by other people and can be checked by media at no cost for them. Okay, so I think, yes, we are great leaders on privacy, but we should be great leaders on integrity, and officials should pay a little bit of cost for this transparency.
Thank you. And any more comments on that? No. Okay, then I'm trying to extracting some of the points. I mean, we have here Mr. Burnett actually had some problems with his microphone and camera. However, he made a few points that I will read out and then ask for the panelists to react to this. He mentioned that this is a very important event because in the age of populism, auditors are a key part of assurance of trust in government. Second point he raises, it is essential that auditors have priorities based partly on assessment of corporate culture and competence of the audited entity. Third point, it is important for auditors to audit in the right things that they are being done, as well as the things that are done right. So this was mentioned before in I believe it was Titi's statement. Or was it actually Ursula? I'm sorry if I confused both, but I mean this issue of things are being done right, or that things are being done simply. And then the compliance with procedures and law is not enough. There is need for public bodies also to secure value for money, especially in procurement. Now, these are a lot of general statements. Maybe it's difficult to extract one question here. I think one thing that always comes back is this issue of one thing being legal and fully in compliance with the rules and the laws and regulations, and then what is actually ethical or not, and how the perception of ethical or what is perceived as okay or not okay, as was discussed before, is heavily influenced by values. And the values, of course, depending on the society. And for international organizations, the key, I would say, challenge and the key problem being that as an international organization is composed of people coming from different environments, from different cultures, from different countries, with different values, strands, full different values. We've seen examples of that were given. The problem being then how to reconcile both and to form an ethical culture and ethical framework in an international organization, and at the same time make sure that everybody adheres to this culture with their own values that they bring with them from childhood on. We have the example of the cake and everything that has happened since then. And I think the question would then be, is there actually a way out of this? Because it is a challenge, and you can put many rules and put more rules on top of rules, and then controls, and making it a very rigid one, where we see that the examples given in some countries there, where the less rules you have and more trust-based society actually brings better results and corruption is going down. What is the ideal way out? I know this sounds pretty much as a very, very general, but there must be an initiation somewhere where you say, we start from this. This would be the first block, no matter where you are in the different ladder on your way to your ethical culture or environment. Tuti, you had raised your hand first.
I was quick in raising my hand, so I'm not answering exactly your last question, where to start. But I think one element that we have to consider is that policy making, and this is in the national and the international context, policy making is becoming very, very complex because we have interlinkages between different policy areas which before were managed by people who could specialize in a given policy area or a given topic. In the old model, we could have people who could individually lead a policy-making project and be individually very much responsible for that given policy area. This was, of course, a risk for integrity because there was no team around that individual to kind of portray and see and mirror, you know, how is your behavior linked to the wider context. Now, what I find fascinating is that that time is past. We cannot do policy making of just having individual and individual and individual in a row, you know, preparing memos or preparing or doing the preparatory policy making in their own locked rooms. We need teams. We need people to come together, work together on a much more complex problem. So people from different sectors with different backgrounds, with different professional language, different professional understanding. It's these teams who actually can create a mini society who should reflect on the ethical implications of the work they are carrying out together. And I think this is one of the responses that we see, for example, in Finland, which has a very silo-based administration and where the biggest risk areas are in between those silos. And we have, you know, individuals who have had a lot of power for very many years and who have had influence. Not that that means corruption or that means that there are irregularities, but they have a sphere of influence that is not counterbalanced by other individuals. And this time is now in the past. We are moving towards networks, we're moving towards teams, interdisciplinary approaches, and in those interlinkages and that dialogue that needs to be fostered in an institutional framework. So leadership must ask for the teams to spend some time and debate on the integrity and ethical questions as well as part of their job. This just an example how we do it when we're thinking about conflict of interest as an auditor. Now, an auditor before would sign a paper every year that they see there's no conflict of interest of them working in the specific sector where they're working. We've changed this so that actually the team who starts an audit has to consider amongst themselves how to balance out potential integrity issues. Say if somebody's relative is working in an agency which that team is auditing. Well, then it means that that sole person is not individually responsible on how we treat the evidence that comes from that agency, for example. There are other people who will balance that out. So it's up to networks of people to together discuss and then find solutions so that we wouldn't have these integrity issues as such.
Thank you. Any further comments on this? No, then perhaps I'd like to take one last question and try to give the floor to Tiago Santos, who had a question. Mr. Santos, are you there? And if yes, if you could, sorry, no camera or microphone here. Okay, then I'll read the question out. It says, aren't we trying to build a house starting from the roof? I mean, codes and overseeing bodies are very well, but the very selection and training of people, particularly politicians and senior managers, has always been on the basis of a system of patronage. With such foundations, how can there be any hope? Would anybody like to comment on that? I think the basic and the foundation. Alina, please.
Well, let's thank very much for these great questions. I think the point actually came up earlier in our conversation because we kept discussing mixing two categories of people. We discussed leaders and people who obviously were heads of these organizations and who are politicians, as Nick suggested earlier, right? And in the same time, we discussed bureaucrats, people who are supposed to be autonomous from politics and from any private interest and just care for the other group of people. Now, corruption generally comes in fact, in politicized organizations, comes where, in fact, bureaucrats are not entirely autonomous from politics. This is why bureaucratic corruption as a term is what we call an oxymoron. It's basically a contradiction in terms, right? If somebody is corrupt, then he is no longer a bureaucrat. Basically means that he yielded to an interest of somebody else. And yes, leadership and politicians are a problem, and this is the arguments that populists make all the time. But I think we can answer that. I mean, I really think that we have considerable tools, only not these very narrow legalistic tools that sometimes keep us prisoners to the past. We invested so much in making these tools being acceptable that now we invest a lot in making them being implemented, but all the time we see, in fact, that there is not much impact and the real battle is elsewhere. The real battle is political, the real battle is at the poll, and at the poll, populists come and just say this is a corrupt establishment which runs Europe, and let's get rid of them. Well, I think that we have exactly the kind of tools which would protect integrity, would be excellent communication tools to fight populists on. Let me just give an example of EU funds. EU funds which should be #1 instrument of selling Europe and showing how good it is to citizens, and which in fact in many countries are associated with profit by prime ministers, as in Hungary and Czech Republic. Top elites, or in fact, if you put a question, I have regression work, I'm able to show in many European countries that the likelihood of winning European funds are greater if you have a political connection. So people who suspect these European funds do not suspect it for granted. It's simply the way of organizing these funds require important past with EU funds. So #1 condition to get EU funds is to have had EU funds before. And in other words, you have to be networked in this small world. And in the end of the day, when you look who evaluates EU funds, you see that we have built very narrow systems where citizens are completely shut out. If you would do an evaluation in Lampedusa and ask citizens of Lampedusa, what EU funds have ever come to Lampedusa? Had they been meaningfully used? But it is exactly the citizens of Lampedusa who are never asked. And today we have digital tools. What prevents us for creating consumer surveys, not polls? By the way, when we do polls, we put leading questions and we organize them. By them, we mean, European institutions ourselves. This is not how it should work. We should really take advantage of the fact that more and more governments, more and more organizations, including, all these EU funds distributions, they offer services digitally. So therefore, we should have all the time digital assessments by users of these services, from green to red. People should say if they believe that these funds were properly used, if they were used with integrity and whatever else, and we would have a barometer every day, and we would not be so shocked when elections days come and people vote for populists. And I think there are several digital tools which can be used to enable people to use transparency and have their say every day and give us very early feedback if something is perceived not to go as it should. And these tools would also, defend us politically, I think.
Thank you very much. Any last comments from our panelists? No. Then I am afraid that we have to wrap up. We are just actually 1 minute short of the end of this session. Many items were raised in the international context, integrity frameworks, the ethics and ethical frameworks, contribution and points of view of supreme audit institutions, and of course Transparency International, the OECD, and the academic world. A few quotes, a few phrases that I would like to remind as a wrap up from my side is: many people yield to temptation, they conform to the environment. If the integrity is high in this environment, there's a high chance that the individuals will also act in a more integrity way. Not breaking the rules and yet not being ethical. The rules do not define integrity. More rules, less integrity. It piles up and it's not a solution. At least it's a feeling that too many rules will actually not necessarily help in building a better integrity and ethical framework and environment. The digital age is there, and it will trigger more ethical questions. New societal era is coming and needs to evolve to the weakest in society and not let them be forgotten. This has also ethical implications. What we see as good is not necessarily the same for everyone. Here comes the issue of the values, different backgrounds in international organizations from the different people that make this organization, and society, history, and culture play a role there. Also, soft controls are needed, and discussion involvement is key to develop an ethical behavior and ethical culture. And also, visible accountability is essential to show that the system works. So visibility and communication are very essential there. Always building around the context and the importance of this, the two examples we had, one from Finland. But too many rules and too many controls cost and do not guarantee an ethical and integrity-based society, as I said before. The advantage of international organizations and the people that compose it or make it is that different professionals with their different background can actually create this, was given as an example, a mini society and reflect on the ethical implications of the society. So this is some power that needs to be used to foster integrity and ethics. I think these are very roughly the general points made. There are a lot of things that have been raised. I may have forgotten a few ones, but I think it summarizes pretty much the challenges that international organizations face. I would like to give the floor now to Michaels to wrap up with concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrice. Thank you very much. While I'll make my concluding remarks, I would like just to share with you one of the news I saw yesterday, that BlackRock, which is the world's largest money manager with around 16,000 employees, has just introduced a new policy making disclosure of all personal relationships with the company's clients compulsory, meaning that not only if you work in the BlackRock and you have a personal relationship with one of the employees, but if a vendor delivers a bucket of flowers to you, you happen to be in certain relationship with him or her, then you have to declare these to your company. So while I'll make my conclusions, the question is whether it is overstretched maybe or not. But coming back to our conference, I think the discussion shows the wide range of views, actually, starting from standard setters, NGOs, auditors, and academia. But the main thing I think that has transpired is that the culture and environment that promotes integrity is key. I appreciate very much the OECD's commitment to lead by example. International organizations are always more under scrutiny. I think some speakers also agreed with that. Hence, the bar for design and implementation of ethical rules should be very high. I think we all agreed on that. No silo approach is another principle which is applied by the OECD, and it is extremely important to raise awareness. I think OECD speaker Ursula introduced an interesting concept, visible accountability, that I have translated as make sure that people see that the rules actually work. So there should be cases, there should be examples that are brought to their visible conclusions. I also would like to underline one more time the role of the NGOs in ensuring accountability and highest integrity standards. And I acknowledge the need that was expressed by a speaker from Transparency International for independent, well-resourced, and diligent oversight that is complemented by cultural elements. And I think this balance that is also something that actually transpires from the academic literature, that there should be a balance. And we are all, I think, all kind of looking for this balance, and this conference is part of this process. Maybe there are golden standards. You mentioned some examples, maybe not. It's difficult to say. I would not like to single out any practice. We also saw, thanks to our speakers from the audit community, that the audit community can be an important player in raising awareness and ensuring more accountability regarding ethical behavior in public administrations. Supreme audit institutions can, as we saw, and should play a role, first of all, by leading by examples and acting as a model. So we have kind of two competing models, Supreme Audit Institutions environment and OECD. The rule book, I wouldn't say that they're competing, they're rather complementary. And secondly, the role of the Supreme Audit Institution could be by proposing improvements to existing integrity rules. That's what I think we are starting to do, and our colleagues mentioned some of the examples. It is also crystal clear that just the code of conduct, the rules are not enough. We need implementation, we need awareness, we need more culture. And there was a very interesting point that integrity issues should be taken as a need for dialogue with society. So, and this is, I think, will also introduce more trust between the organization and society if there is more dialogue. The question is obviously how to make sure it happens, yeah, this could be obviously a topic for a separate event. Our speaker, Auditor General of Finland, brought one more interesting issue, I think, into the whole debate: the urgent need to think about the future, how to code ethical values in digital world. Yeah, and I think there were also some interesting elements that the audit community need to reflect about potential audit topics in the field of ethics and integrity, including the Court of Auditors itself. And the idea about teamworks on ethics, I think, was very interesting and certainly deserves more reflection. I really appreciate also the insight from our representative of the academia, that taking extra cake is in the nature of human being. So we should probably limit the number of cakes that are on the tables. That would also be good for our diets, but also maybe for ethics and integrity issues. Creation of the right environment, I think, was very important summary of your Ms. Pipidi intervention, and obviously there are many elements how to make sure it actually happens. So again, I could go on with actually enumerating many interesting ideas that you brought forward, but I thought, unfortunately, we have to round up. Really, we are already 8 minutes behind the schedule. I would like to really very much thank you for your different insights, for your very open views, for your very professional dealing with the questions from our moderator and our audience. Thank you to the audience. I mean, I think on average we have around 160, 170 participants at this event, which is, I guess, a very good also tool to raise the awareness. So I thank you all for joining, and I hope that most of you, or even all of you, would join our second session that will kick off at 3:15. 3:15 European time. So thank you all again, and thank you also to obviously our colleagues at the Court of Auditors, the whole team who made this event possible. The main risk for us is that something would break down technically, and it didn't happen. So for this, I thank sincerely all of them, and obviously all the colleagues who contributed to participation and to the preparation, the colleagues from my office, Laura, Simona, Fabrice as a moderator, and again, but most of you, thanks to all of you. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in the afternoon. Have a nice lunch.
You.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.